Okay. In some ways, it seems like a completely different subject, but as you're going to see next week, the two subjects were intimately related. I think I've already used the phrase, scratch a brown shirt and you'll find a red. Brown being, of course, the color of the Nazis, red being the color of the communists. It wasn't simply that one phenomenon historically kind of gave rise to the other, but that in many ways Hitler and Stalin literally learned from each other. That is, they learned from each other's tactics and methods. Hitler first learned from Lenin, later on he learned some from Stalin, and then Stalin, as we're going to see next week, also learned from Hitler. But the thing about Hitler is his rise to power was very different in a lot of ways from what we saw in the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks were not subtle. When they didn't like the parliament, because of course they lost the elections, they just surrounded it with armed force and started shooting. You remember that's what they did in January 1918. The assembly that was actually elected after the October Revolution was simply dismissed by force by the Bolsheviks. They never had anything remotely resembling a popular mandate to rule. There's a line that is sometimes used to describe the difference between the communists and the Nazis, which is a little racy, but it goes something like this. The communists realized that Russians could be raped, whereas Hitler knew Germans needed to be seduced. Well, it's crude, but there's something to it. Hitler, after all, did kind of, sort of emerge from the ballot box. Kind of, sort of. The kind of, sort of is important because there's a general notion out there that the Nazis were popular. That's true, they were. However, Hitler did not ascend to power by democratic means. He didn't ascend to power by illegal means either. He ascended to power, rather, by backdoors intrigue, which was all legal, at least on the surface, even if it was against the spirit of the law, and all of it happened entirely accidentally. In fact, there was nothing inevitable about it, as you will see today. Hitler is a classic illustration of the dictum that it is better to be lucky than to be good. He had immense luck, both in timing and also in the quality of his opponents, and in the end, in the qualities of even some of his allies and friends. I'll explain what I mean in due time. For now, just to bring us back to where we left off. We left off with the beer hall putsch. Hitler slinking away kind of ignominiously. Initially his opponents said that he had rather cowardly just kind of, dived to the ground when the police began firing. That's not really fair because basically his bodyguard, Graf, who was in front of him, got shot and then pulled him down from one side. And then Scheubner Richter, one of his key aides and adjutants, was shot on the other side of him in the lungs. So he was kind of pulled down violently by force, and actually one of his arms was dislocated. Now, as he often did, Hitler, of course, immediately vowed to shoot himself. I mean, the number of times he told people he would shoot himself in the 15 years before he ascended to power they'd probably be in the hundreds. It's too bad he didn't actually take up his own vow on one of these occasions. But people would always convince him, no, no, no. You're too essential to the movement. Oh, we can't do without you. I think it was actually the wife of Ernst Putzi Hanfstaengl who told him this time. A woman who sort of just, whispered in his ear, how essential he was. He was like a messiah to his followers, and he couldn't desert them now. So even though he was in pain, even though he was humiliated and disgraced, he didn't shoot himself. And it turned out she was right, because he basically got, okay, he was arrested, yes. He was charged with treason, yes. They sent him to prison, yes. But they sent him to a particular type of prison, which was kind of used for, shall we say, favored figures of the regime, who in this era tended to be quote-unquote on the right. I've said again, the term right doesn't really make sense for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. But it makes sense for those who claimed, that is, to be representing the rights of the true nation, the true German race. They tended to be looked at somewhat more favorably by the government than those on the left. The opposite, of course, was true in countries ruled by the left, but this was definitely true in Germany. Although paradoxically, the part I never could figure out is that Germany at the time actually was still under the rule of the SPD. But when it comes to who really rules a country, you should always look a little bit behind the scenes. Yes, the socialists were theoretically in control of the government, but they didn't really control the judiciary or the courts or public opinion. In fact, it's said that the socialists really lost the Weimar Republic when Friedrich Ebert, the socialist president, the first president of Weimar Germany, rather foolishly allowed himself to be photographed in a bathing suit. That is, with like his bare fat legs visible. The reason this was so fatal was because Germany, as an intensely patriotic but also military country, of course had a reverence for men in uniform. And this was wholly improper and just in very bad taste and very bad form. So even though the socialists were kind of sort of the ruling party, much of the rest of the country, the military, the courts, the public, whole areas like Bavaria were really controlled by the right. And so even though they thought, well, we can't deny that Hitler tried to overthrow the government by force, after all he did. We can't deny it, but still, we'll give him like a nice suite in the prison. And everyone saluted him in the prison as if he was like some kind of commanding officer, which was completely untrue. He was sort of like the unofficial spokesman of the disgraced German racist nationalist right. And so they allowed him to have visitors and correspondence and whatever else he wanted, including books. In fact, this was significant because Hitler, of course, never went to college. In fact, Hitler, before the First World War, had basically just been a homeless bum. And that's literally what he was. He lived in what they called a home for men, which is to say for men without means, money, or apartments. He was a bum, basically. In fact, even when he was painting successfully, when he was like selling postcards and things, he was swindled by his partner, so he didn't even make money from that. He was a total and utter failure in his prior life. World War I, of course, had given him the sense of purpose and camaraderie, which eventually was kind of transmogrified into his peculiar demonic vision after the war. The kind of Nazi vision, that is, of a world where Germany had been deprived of its true victory. But the fact remains, he was still basically a kind of uneducated bohemian. He had no job. Yeah, he had been running this political party, but it's not like he actually knew how to do anything. He'd never been to college. Yeah, he could read, but mostly he read like newspapers and things. So this prison period, it was significant for him in several ways. One, he already learned from the beer hall putsch that Germany was not a country in which you wanted to stage a putsch. It was basically a law-abiding country. So, if he came to power, it would have to be legally. He learned that lesson. He also spent his time first reading, basically catching up on all the books that he hadn't gotten to read earlier on in his life, because he had never sort of been to college. He never really had a period to do serious, reading and thinking. And it was during this period, of course, that he wrote his famous book, which unfortunately is still a bestseller around the world. For the life of me, I still don't know why. Have any of you tried reading it ever? Mein Kampf? You've tried. How far did you get?
Well, I finished it.
You finished it?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a true pain in the butt.
Yeah, I never finished it. I tried. Has anyone else tried it a little? Usually people make it about like 3 pages in. It's turgid. The prose is extremely dense and thick, and it's full of all this paranoia and dark visions and hatred. I suppose if you share some of that hatred, it might appeal to you, but it's not exactly a great literary production. In a way, it's not really Hitler at his best. Not that Hitler was ever really at his best in any qualitative sense. But he did have talents. He was a great speaker. He was a great orator. He was not a great writer. That said, the book eventually became a bestseller simply because he became famous, and it was one of those classic unread bestsellers where everyone bought it because they thought it represented something. They didn't actually read it. Unfortunately, because had more people read this book, they would have realized that the man was a true fanatic who really did harbor this horrendous, vicious hatred of the Jews, blaming them for all the problems of the human race, and who really did want Germany to wage an expansionist war, basically conquering land in the east and displacing the people and cleansing them and expelling them. It's all there in the book, but very few people read it. So he got to kind of emerge quietly again from obscurity. He already had a reputation as a kind of rabble-rouser. People who paid attention knew he was an anti-Semite, but there were a lot of anti-Semites in Germany at the time. He wasn't necessarily that big of a factor in German politics after he emerged from prison. In fact, the party had really gone into decline while he was in prison. It had lost a lot of members. It was, losing voters. A lot of this was just because of the quieting down of Germany after the hyperinflation. You remember that brief period of kind of prosperity and trade and so on. But Hitler, again, he had learned his lesson. He was going to be patient. He was going to wait. He wasn't going to force things. He rebuilt the party organization. And when I say organization, I mean a real organization in the way only Germans can do it. Not just like a treasurer and someone who, follows the budget and who organizes the party program. He had what he called Gauleiters. He had like individual district commanders for every area in Germany, and then even outside Germany in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia. And they were sort of like the overall party dictator for that area, who would direct strategy and report directly to Hitler. So they're like a fringe party without many voters, but they're already developing this kind of weird dual, almost like state within a state apparatus, which, if the party ever did become more popular, might be a serious force. Well, it didn't happen right away. In 1928, they had new elections for the Reichstag. The Nazis got about 3% of the vote. Now, they didn't have the rules that you have in modern Turkey, which are in fact partly designed with the Weimar problem in mind. That is, where the fringe parties don't get seats. That's why the AK Party gets so many seats, in part because they get to swallow up the seats of the fringe parties. The Nazis actually did get 12 seats. So they got to sit in the Reichstag, which was important only in the practical sense that if you were in the Reichstag, they couldn't arrest you. And the Nazis did a lot of really illegal things. So it was useful. You also got to ride the trains for free. You got to use the mails. It made you sort of seem legitimate. So yeah, they've got 12 seats in the Reichstag. But the Reichstag has, what, like I don't remember the exact, it's like 530 or something. They're, in other words, a tiny, 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 tiny fringe party. 3% of the vote. Yeah, they have this whole apparatus. Hitler's a great speaker, yada, yada, yada. No big deal. Nobody takes him terribly seriously. The reason, again, if you remember, is that the country had quieted down. There's no more hyperinflation. The Ruhr crisis was over. Trade was beginning to recover. The American bank loans are pouring in. Everything seems to be going pretty well. As we all know, of course, this didn't last. In fact, in Germany, the recession began even before the Wall Street crash, but was then exacerbated seriously by it. The main reason being, if you remember, that Germany was heavily dependent on American loan finance. The Germans owed reparations, they owed money to bankers. Yeah, they had inflated away their own debts, but they still did owe a lot of other money. And the American loans just suddenly dry up. There was another key event in this cycle, which you may see in the textbooks. There's a bank called Kreditanstalt, which weirdly enough was actually an Austrian bank. But because this bank failed and it was tied to a bunch of banks in Germany, it led to a sort of domino effect. That wasn't until pretty late in the game, though. That wasn't until May of 1931. 1929, 1930, even after the Wall Street crash, it wasn't like Armageddon yet. Remember, the Great Depression took a long time for its effects to really be felt. That said, a couple of key events had already begun to intervene in Hitler's career. One of the ones that all the textbooks talk about. It's just a weird sort of a political campaign that he latches onto. You remember that Hitler, his big message was always about the Versailles Treaty, denouncing the November criminals who had signed it, consigning Germany to pay these reparations. Well, periodically, as you remember, they kept renegotiating the reparations, almost always to Germany's advantage. In fact, the latest one, there's a US banker called Arthur Young. You don't really need to remember his name. The latest one was to make Germany's payments even smaller, but they would be sort of extended out over a longer time. So, you could argue one of two ways. You could say, well, this is better for us because we don't have to pay as much now, our economy is in recession. Or you could say, like the Nazis, the whole thing was a crime to be denounced. You could also take the angle that was a little more moderate, and you could say, well, yes, we're paying less, but now we're supposed to pay until like 1986, and that's just insulting. I'm not even going to be alive then. My children might not be alive then. It's like putting us in hock through the generations. So there was a lot of potential for, shall we say, demagogy, for people to denounce this as yet another burden on Germany. And there were a lot of people who opposed it. The whole thing was basically being decided by the government, but there was a provision in the Weimar Constitution where if you got enough signatures, you could organize a popular plebiscite, like a straight up or down vote, by the public. And they were basically going to say that this was, unconstitutional or against the German people or something. And so Hitler, as you might expect, is against it, so he joins the other people who were against it. The reason this matters is because he is introduced to a certain extent to slightly more mainstream respectable figures in German politics. The most significant of these was Alfred Hugenberg. Now his political party was not really that successful. It was sort of like a moderate right to right-wing nationalist party. But he himself was a publisher, he had a lot of newspapers, he had a lot of friends in business. So he was a very respectable figure. The phrase you sometimes hear is that Hugenberg made Hitler, quote, salonfähig, which, is German for sort of like acceptable to polite society. That is, he could now be introduced at parties and fundraisers as a legitimate figure. He wasn't just this crazy, weird bohemian guy with a goofy mustache, who wore a whip, and had this weird political past in the beer hall putsch. He was a respectable politician, just a little crazier, a little more excitable than the rest. So yes, he starts introducing Hitler around. Now here we come up to one of the controversial elements of Nazism and the rise of the party. Marxist historians, and even at the time Marxist politicians, and those who have taken up their cudgel, have long argued that Hitler was, quote-unquote, a tool of big business. That is to say that Hugenberg, at this time, began introducing Hitler to people like Fritz Thyssen, who controlled steel, some of the other big German industrialists, and so Hitler became like a front man for big capital. You can see why the communists would believe this. It's part of their materialist explanation of history and the way politics and economics are supposed to work. It was grossly wrong. In fact, Hitler did not get a lot of money from big business. In fact, Hitler and the Nazis were rather hostile to big business because they saw it as Jewish. And the communists and the socialists, and you should keep this in mind through the story to come, they were both handicapped in their opposition to Hitler, not merely by how much they hated each other, but by the fact that they just did not understand Hitler or Nazism. Up to the end, right up until Hitler seized power and started moving against these parties, they believed that he was just some like innocuous frontman for capital, for big business interests. That's what they called him der kleine Adolf, little Adolf. They thought he was just a nothing, he was a nobody. The communists, in fact, had this peculiar doctrine they called social fascism. Now, the upshot of this doctrine was that the socialists were worse than the Nazis. That is, the SPD, because they were kind of like the establishment party, the party of Ebert, the party who were really almost like behind the Weimar Constitution and regime. Because they were part of the establishment, they were more dangerous. Because they were sort of tricking the workers preventing them from understanding their true interests, preventing them from, that is, seeing the hideousness of the capitalist enemy. Whereas Hitler was like useful. He was so ugly and such a caricature that he wasn't really dangerous at all. And that's what they literally said to the end of the Weimar Republic. The communists continued opposing everything the socialists did, calling them social fascists, denouncing them as worse than the Nazis. So that is one of the answers to this question as to how could it happen. You have these two large parties representing supposedly, the working class, the proletariat. They're virtually at war with one another. And they also do not understand in the least the nature of their enemy, because they're basically fooled by their own ideology into thinking that Hitler is a tool. Hitler was very much his own man. He was never a creature of big business. Now, it's interesting to note that this is not to say Hitler was a socialist. There were, however, real socialists inside the Nazi Party. One of them, a guy called Gregor Strasser, and his brother Otto, they were both from the north of Germany. They were from Hamburg primarily. And the northern branches of the Nazi Party, because they came from the more industrialized sections of Germany, they actually did tend to be authentically socialist. Yes, they were nationalists too, so they weren't like communist Marxists, but they really did look after the interests of the working class. They took the socialist part of the message, that is the S in NSDAP, they took that seriously. Strasser was, in fact, in some ways, the second most powerful Nazi behind Hitler. It's true there were others like Hermann Göring, we'll encounter him in a moment. Ernst Röhm, he was the head of the so-called SA, the Sturmabteilung. This is like the thug wing of the Nazis, the stormtroopers, they're sometimes called in shorthand. They were powerful in a way, but they were all loyal to Hitler. Strasser was almost like his own man. He had his own whole section of the party that was loyal to him. Now, Hitler and Strasser did not always get along. In fact, Hitler basically revealed to Strasser around like 1930 that he himself was not a serious socialist. Now, that's not to say he was, again, a tool of big business. It's just Hitler thought in bigger terms. Hitler wanted a German empire. He knew that he needed German industry. He needed German business. He needed the army. He needed all these things to work. He didn't want to destroy them in the name of socialism. He didn't like businessmen, but he needed them. Strasser, on the other hand, was an ideological socialist. So there's tension between the two of them. And Hitler was by no means in control of the whole party. Most of it was loyal to him, yes, but Strasser had his own loyalists. Okay, now we get to the political scene. The Nazis, as I have said, they're becoming more important, but they're still a fringe party. A couple of things intervened to change this, however. One is, of course, the onset of the economic crisis and so on. Now, the economic crisis then has political effects. The last kind of authentic cabinet in terms of it being politically legitimate and backed by a majority in the Reichstag was under a man called Hermann Müller, who belonged to the SPD. That is the Socialist Party. Remember, the kind of establishment party. Now, the socialists were in a very difficult position. Most of their voters were, of course, either working class, members of the working class, supporters of the working class, many of them now losing their jobs. Now, they themselves would have liked to spend money on things like unemployment benefits. But if you remember, Germany's hands were tied in a way, partly because of the gold standard, but also because of the recent experience of hyperinflation. No one wanted inflation again, and so they had to be very careful about printing money, like FDR would later do in America. So paradoxically, they had to be really conservative. Now, not all socialists were happy about this. There was like dissension in the ranks. Eventually, dissension inside the party, between this party and one of its coalition partners, led to the fall of this cabinet. This is in the March of 1930. So they have to have new elections. Now, these elections are significant because they represented the first serious inroads for the Nazis. The Depression is starting to bite. Unemployment is starting to spread. The Nazis they went from about 3% of the vote, or about 800,000 votes. Now they get 6.4 million. So it's almost a quarter of the vote, multiplies by a factor of 8. The number of seats in the Reichstag is up to about 107. It's still nowhere near a majority. They're only about like a quarter, but they're starting to become a factor. The other thing that's important about this episode, though, the fall of the Müller cabinet, which was 2 years earlier, that is, than it was supposed to last. It was supposed to last until 1932. Is that now you basically have paralysis in the Reichstag. A peculiar element of the Weimar Constitution is that although it was theoretically a parliamentary system, the president basically appointed the Reichstag. The president appointed the cabinet. The cabinet was supposed to be supported by the Reichstag in the way you know how parliaments are supposed to work. The party that controls parliament theoretically should become the head of state, the chancellor, essentially, or the prime minister, as it's often called. However, in the Weimar Constitution, there was a provision by which the president could simply allow his own chancellor to rule by emergency decree if there was no way of getting a majority in the Reichstag. The Reichstag was not powerless. The Reichstag could issue what was called a no-confidence vote, that is, voting down the government. However, the new cabinet, even though it was not very strong, not very popular, it was sort of a centrist cabinet. A guy called Heinrich Brüning, he was in the Center Party, which was basically the party of German Catholics. It was particularly strong in Catholic areas like Bavaria. The new cabinet, although not popular and not possessing a majority in the Reichstag, was allowed to rule basically because the SPD thought any other cabinet that followed it would be even worse. They were worried that maybe the Nazis would come to power. They were worried that one of the far-right nationalist parties would come to power. And so the SPD quietly acquiesces in this cabinet, blocking any no-confidence motions. That is, they allow it to rule as a kind of negative majority cabinet, a presidential cabinet. This matters for a couple of reasons. The first is that basically the socialists they keep shooting themselves in the foot in a way. They argued they didn't support their own chancellor, so he fell. Then the next cabinet was in many ways even worse, and they decided to support it, even though it was unpopular. Now, Brüning's cabinet, its own approach to the Depression was kind of even worse than the previous cabinet. Because of the gold standard, because of the fear of inflation, they basically had a deflationary policy, keeping a very strict control of the money supply. They also reduced government spending, and they cut a lot of benefits. There were a couple of other things they did, however, which were sort of like Keynesian stimulus measures. None of it really made sense. The policies didn't make sense. They didn't work. Unemployment continued to get worse. It spiraled out of control. The dominoes fell with the failure of the Austrian bank. So by 1932, things are getting really ugly. You've got unemployment of like 30%. And you have people milling out in the streets for no reason constantly. I talked about before how the reduction in size of the German army to 100,000 meant there were all these surplus weapons around. The main parties, the SPD, the KPD, the Nazis, they all have paramilitaries. Now, the stormtroopers, the SA, they were the most famous of these kind of paramilitary groups. But they were by no means the only ones. They would fight with the communists. At times, people would actually switch sides. They were all kind of like professional fighters, brawlers. Sometimes they would just walk up to someone in the street and just shoot them. It was really ugly. There was one episode in the July of 1932 alone where the Nazis and communists, fought it out in the streets in Altona, and there was something like 30 or 40 casualties. It was almost like a civil war battle. So by 1932, things are really bad. Brüning, basically, he doesn't have any kind of following, any kind of popular following, so he finally agrees to step down. Now, meanwhile, who is in charge? The person who appointed Brüning was President Paul von Hindenburg. You may remember him as the nominal victor of the Tannenberg battle in 1914, even though Ludendorff was the real mastermind. He's this kind of very prim and proper Prussian officer. By this point, he is, in his late 70s. By the early 30s, he's in his 80s. So he's an old man. Basically, he represents the past. He represents nostalgia. Germans who remember better times. He wasn't senile exactly, but whether he was in full possession of his faculties is another question. Hindenburg had been elected in 1925. He was actually re-elected early in 1932, running against Hitler. Hitler got about 35% of the vote, showing he was popular, but not nearly as popular as Hindenburg, because everyone else saw Hindenburg as like the only thing saving them from Hitler, basically. And so 65% of the people, more or less, voted for Hindenburg to save themselves from Hitler. Because they thought Hindenburg, yeah, he was an old guy, yeah, he came from another era, but partly for that reason, people thought he would block Hitler from coming to power. Because among other things, Hitler was a corporal. He'd never risen above the rank of corporal. Hindenburg was a field marshal. So he would automatically look down on Hitler as a kind of upstart. Not to mention the fact that Hitler was also an Austrian who spoke German with an accent. In fact, Hitler wasn't even a citizen. They had to rush through his citizenship application so he could run for president in 1932 against Hindenburg. And they had to give him German diction lessons so that he would sound more like a German. So people are kind of counting on Hindenburg. Hindenburg, though, is starting to waver in his loyalties. He was never really a staunch supporter of the Constitution. And besides which, the Constitution gave him all kinds of powers. He could appoint the whole cabinet. He could allow them to rule by emergency decree. Now, it's clear that Brüning is not popular and nobody's happy with Brüning. And basically, it's like Brüning can't even control the country. There's violence in the streets. And so basically, Hindenburg gets together with some of his military advisors, because all of his friends are in the military. And they start moving towards what would probably become some kind of military dictatorship. The first step is to appoint a kind of puppet chancellor, a man called Franz von Papen, who history buffs here might know was actually posted ambassador to Turkey in the Second World War. He also spent a lot of time in Turkey in the First World War. He was also in America in the First World War, where he helped organize the sabotage of arms production factories. He's an interesting figure, but politically speaking, he was like a nothing. You know, he had no experience, he had no following. Weirdly, he came from the same political party as Brüning. And so when he replaced Brüning, his own party turned against him because they saw him as a traitor. So he didn't even have the support of his own party. He had the support of a couple people on the far right, and then the president's advisors behind the military. I mean, literally, his popular support was like zero. And he is now put in the chancellery. The only thing they can think of to even have him to have a chance of kind of quieting down Germany is to cut some kind of a deal with the Nazis. Not to give the Nazis power, mind you, but to make sure that they will kind of like block these no-confidence votes in the Reichstag. That's the idea anyway. So Papen gets together with the Nazis. This is all, by the way, orchestrated not by Franz von Papen himself, but by his friend Kurt von Schleicher. You should definitely remember this name. It's up over there as well. Schleicher he's sort of like the eminence grise of the president's military regime. During the First World War, he had been in charge of kind of liaison between the army and the civilian forces for things like rationing economic goods. And so even though he was like a stiff German military officer, you know, he also had civilian contacts, he had friends in the labor movement. He was kind of like an all-purpose political mastermind. So Schleicher basically thinks, look, we'll appoint this puppet, my buddy, Franz von Papen. We'll run him from behind the scenes. We'll tell him what to do. So the first thing they do is they say, okay, we'll cut a deal with the Nazis. Now the deal goes something like this. Right now, the Nazi stormtroopers, the SA, along with most of the other paramilitary groups, are under an outright ban. Now, true, they're still brawling anyway, but theoretically they're supposed to be arrested if they're even shown on the streets. And so Papen tells the Nazis, well, look, I'll lift this ban on your stormtrooper thugs. I'll allow them to operate in the streets. The idea being partly so they can like beat up the communists. I'll allow them to operate if you support my cabinet. We'll have new elections, you'll probably do well, and then you can support my cabinet and we'll all rule together and we'll stop the communist threat. And Hitler says, okay, that sounds nice. We'll do it. So they lift a ban on the stormtroopers. The stormtroopers come out on the streets and start beating up communists. And of course, the situation gets even worse. And so Papen then responds by, in a, shall we say, rather undemocratic action, this unelected chancellor deposes the elected government of Prussia. Prussia being, remember, the state that had created Germany. It's still the largest state in Germany. It's the most important. And more significantly, the Prussian police, it's the second largest armed force in the country behind the army. It's almost as big as the army. The government had been controlled by the socialists. In other words, it was like a pro-Republican government. Now it is deposed by Franz von Papen, who basically deprives the socialists of control over the police. Now this is important because basically it's like you've got the army, which is only 100,000. You've got the police of Prussia, which is about 50,000. And then you have these paramilitary groups. The stormtroopers themselves have more than 100,000. So now, basically what the government thought is, if we control the police and the army on the kind of reactionary right-wing side, and the Nazis kind of tacitly support us, then we can protect everyone from the communists. Now that was the theory. In practice, what it basically meant, though, was that the socialists and the Republicans now had control of no significant armed force. The Nazis got what they wanted, which was new elections. They knew that because the depression was getting worse, because of the street violence, they could do even better. In fact, this is where bad news was good news for the Nazis. Basically what the Nazis would do is go out in the streets and beat people up, which would produce violence and chaos. And then they would promise the voters, if you elect us, we'll stop the violence and chaos. Which, of course, they could do because they were the ones starting it. But the argument, of course, was, well, the communists are worse, and so if you want to protect your business, your property, you elect us because we're tougher than the communists, and we'll more or less kind of beat them up. Now, it's significant that at this time, Hitler is not really emphasizing the anti-Semitic message. Significant because people often claim that all Germans were anti-Semites and all the rest of it. Well, when the Nazis were most popular, that's when Hitler was actually saying the least anti-Semitic things. He was talking about employment, business, the communists, etc. Anyway, long story short, the elections of July 1932 were an absolute disaster for the establishment centrist parties. The Nazis got 14 million votes. The communists also got their biggest vote of all time, which was, I guess, 3 or 4 million. Not nearly as many as the Nazis got. It was overall about 37.4% of the vote. They now had 230 seats in the Reichstag. Not a majority, but pretty close. They could probably team up with a party like the Catholic Center Party and get a majority. Conceivably, that is. It's significant because this was actually the highest vote total they ever got in a free election in Germany, 37.4%. Not too far from what the AK Party got in 2002, interestingly. It did not, however, get them a majority in the Reichstag, because they didn't have the same rules that you did. So, although he was kind of the most popular politician in Germany, he didn't really have a majority, and he didn't really want to be a parliamentary chancellor anyway. Basically, if you remember, he had promised Franz von Papen that he would support him. Now he goes to Papen and he says, what are you, joking? You've got no following. I have 14 million votes. I should be chancellor. Franz von Papen talks to the president, and the president says, what? Appoint this Austrian corporal chancellor? I should as like make him postmaster general. In other words, he will not consider appointing Hitler chancellor. He simply will not allow it. So Franz von Papen is still the chancellor. But he has no support in the Reichstag. So as soon as the Reichstag gets together, they're going to vote no confidence. Now Papen knows this. And so he talks to the president, who by this point he's sort of insinuated himself in with Hindenburg. He whispers sweet nothings in his ear. He, like Hindenburg, he's an aristocrat, he's an officer, he knows how to talk in the right way with the right respectful tones. So he tells the president, look, you can't have Hitler as chancellor. So here's what we do. You give me a decree where I can dissolve the Reichstag, only without calling new elections. And I'll just sort of continue on. without a parliament. And the president says, well, all right. So they decide to do it. It's basically unconstitutional, but they can claim, emergency circumstances. So this is the plan. Papen, after Hitler has, as he sees it, betrayed him, Papen decides to go to the Reichstag with this decree from the president, dissolving it without calling for new elections. So you really have then sort of like a military dictatorship. And he gets there, and he's got this decree in his hand, and he's about to do it. But the Nazis, remember, are the largest party in the Reichstag. And they now have the speaker's gavel. And they are, shall we say, thugs. And they're not going to let this guy Franz von Papen steal their thunder. In fact, Hermann Goering himself is now the Speaker of the Reichstag. Soon to be mass murdering Hermann Goering. And so he basically pushes Papen out of the way and says, we declare no confidence in your government, before he can even issue the decree dissolving the parliament. So the Nazis win, they humiliate Franz von Papen, and they get basically new elections. We're not done yet, though. The Nazis get new elections. We think that they're a popular party that comes to power through the ballot box. What happens, though? They actually lose votes. Why? Well, this is like the fourth election of the year. There was a presidential election. There was the other election. There were a bunch of other local elections. First of all, everyone's sick of elections. They're also sick of the Nazis. And the people who are in favor of the Nazis are sick of the fact that no matter how many times they vote Nazi, nothing happens. Because Hitler never accepts any post in the government other than Chancellor. He refuses to accept any other post. So they start deserting the party. They lose 2 million votes. They're still the biggest party in the Reichstag, but just barely. They've lost influence. So this time, Hitler goes and says, look, you must make me Chancellor. And the president looks him in the eye, and he tells him no. And then he issues this statement to the German people, and I quote, I cannot, in good conscience, make you Chancellor. For a presidential cabinet led by you would develop into a party dictatorship with all of its consequences for the heightening of contradictions in the German nation. This is something I could never reconcile with my oath or my conscience. So the president has now vowed eternally never to appoint Hitler Chancellor. The Nazis are demoralized. Gregor Strasser, who controls half the party, is now basically threatening to split the party in two and run away with half of Hitler's support. The stormtroopers, they're not being paid because they have no money. People start deserting the Nazi party. They're deserting the stormtroopers. Hitler is abandoned. He is isolated. In fact, the newspaper headlines, if you read them at the end of 1932, they all said this. Whew, thank God, crisis averted. One of them even said, well, what will our grandchildren ask us about then? What was his name? Adalbert something? Hitler? Hitler? Who? Everyone thought they were through the storm. No chance. The president won't appoint Hitler Chancellor. He is isolated. Papen, he's no longer in power. Basically, Schleicher says, you've tried enough, so Schleicher takes over. Hitler is isolated. Hitler is done. So what happens? Does anyone have an idea? How does the story end? How does Hitler come to power? Nope. It all happens in the course of a month. Basically, this happens. Von Papen, after being humiliated by the Nazis, is forced to step down. His friend, who had put him in power in the first place, Kurt von Schleicher, takes over. Franz von Papen gets angry. He gets angry. It's just really that simple. I mean, yeah, the Nazis had humiliated him, but like he didn't know the Nazis. You know, they weren't his friend. Kurt von Schleicher was his friend. And so what Papen does is he goes and he has a secret meeting with Hitler. And he says, look, I still want to be Chancellor, but you should support me. Papen is so desperate to return to power and taste the honeypots of power again that in the course of about 6 meetings with Hitler, he finally allows Hitler to convince him that no, only Hitler will be Chancellor. Papen will not be Chancellor, even though that's what he wants. Meanwhile, the socialist press, they keep announcing that they will fight the coming dictatorship of Franz von Papen. But of course, Von Papen is, shall we say, not of Hitler's caliber. He, in the end, accedes to all of Hitler's demands. He then convinces Hindenburg, his son Oscar. Oscar, by the way, his only role in this is that he's the son of the president, and the president listens to him. And apparently Oscar and Schleicher had some argument or something, so he turns against Schleicher too. So they conspire. It's a conspiracy of about 3 men. Hitler, the president's son, and Franz von Papen all convinced the tottering 85-year-old President Hindenburg to violate his promise, which he made to the German people, again, never to appoint Hitler chancellor. They simply tell him, look, Schleicher's an asshole, so you need to appoint Hitler chancellor. Now, amazingly, this whole thing could have still been averted. One key date, which you never see in the textbooks, but it's very interesting. On January 20th, 1933, they had a little procedural meeting. I know we're past time, but I think this is interesting. They had a little procedural meeting of the Reichstag committee. All they decided was, when will the Reichstag meet again? Now, they knew that if it met again and they dissolved the chamber, the Nazis would be done, because they'd have to do another election. They'd probably lose another 5 million votes. And the last thing Hitler wanted was another election. And so the question was, how long can they postpone the time that the Reichstag would meet again? Amazingly, Schleicher did not know that these people were conspiring against him. He actually had the chance. He controlled the agenda of the committee meeting. He could have said, let's postpone this meeting for another 3 or 4 months. By that time, the depression would have eased. The whole political situation would have been different. Hitler would have been done. His party would have been in ruins. But he thought he had the support of the president. It was a simple misjudgment. He trusted his own instincts too much. And so he agreed to let the parliament meet. Unbeknownst to him, this conspiracy was gathering steam. And so these 3 men together basically conspired to put Hitler in power. It was 3 men, no one else. It was all a conspiracy. It didn't have anything to do with elections or democracy. It was a pure and total accident that ultimately depended on one person, Franz von Papen, getting angry at his friend. And that is how Hitler came to power. Produced the Second World War and the deaths of 50 million people. As simple as that. I kid you not. Okay, so I know I ran through time. Most of you are probably desperate to see your exam scores. So I'm going to put the magic sheet right here. I will post the scores on my door in due time. And if you need to see your exam, please come by my office during office hours, because I don't think any of us have time for that right now.